Good evening, everybody. Hello, can you hear me well? Yeah, fantastic. Delighted to see so many people here. We're back up and running with all of our annual series of free events, and audiences are growing again, which is fantastic after the pandemic. So delighted to see so many of you here again for this, the 10th annual Creative Writing Lecture, and one that's been slightly delayed by a year, as I think many of you probably know. Val was coming last year to give this very talk and was struck down by the dreaded C-19 the day before the event. So I'm so pleased that you've decided to make good on the deal from last year. Thank you so much. Indeed, I've been talking to Val's agent since 2019 about making this happen, so I'm particularly delighted that it finally has. There have been all kinds of related reasons why it got delayed. My name's Harry Whitehead. I'm the director of the Centre for New Writing, of which this is the showcase annual event, both for the Centre for New Writing and also for the School of Arts. A couple of safety points of order. If the alarm goes, it's real, so we'll have to get out of here. You can either head for the fire escape, which takes you directly outside the building there, or through this door as well. Okay, so I'm very happy that for many years the annual Creative Writing Lecture has been sponsored by the university's alumni charitable division, which is why we're able to keep this event free and have done for as long as we have. So thanks very much to them, and I shall be pestering them very soon for next year. Previous years, you've seen the spool going on. We've had some amazing writers giving this lecture, from Ben Oakrey to Michael Moore-Pergo, from Laura Esquivel to Edna O'Brien, and the last lecture was Marlon James. So Val's in some good company, I think, giving this talk. Outside of Literary Leicester, in this event, we have events running all through the year, so do please keep an eye on us. This year we've had writing workshops and talks from people like Adele Parks, Liz Jensen, Louis de Bernier, who, very honoured to say, is actually in the audience tonight. Hello, Louis. So arts remains thriving here at the university. Long may it continue, and long may we keep giving these talks and workshops for free. Okay, so a couple of details about the talk tonight. Val's going to talk for a while, and then once she's finished, we'll have time for some Q&As. There'll be a couple of roaming mics, so please put your hand up and wait for one of our students to run up and offer up the mic, because we are recording this event as well. Once the event's finished, there'll be an opportunity to buy some books and to get your book signed as well, because we're quite a big audience. There'll be a kind of a snake-like queue outside, so please bear with us if it takes a little while. I'm not going to give one of those exhaustive academic introductions to our guest speaker. You'll be hugely relieved, I'm sure, because we're all here because we know and love Val McDermid's work, which has been translated into more than 40 languages and has been just the most gigantic success. And she keeps delivering books every year, which is a marvelous talent just in itself. She's also a regular on TV, radio and print. She's had a couple of BBC Radio 4 dramas produced, and even more amazingly to me, she captained the 2016 winning University Challenge alumnus team, and even more so, she was also the Celebrity Mastermind champion a few years ago. Marvellous stuff. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and the Royal Society of Edinburgh as well, and I'm just hugely delighted to welcome to Leicester, Val McDermid.
Thanks, Harry. So no pressure there then. Thank you all for coming out. Thanks for inviting me this week of all weeks to a city notable for the burial of a king. It's particularly appropriate for me as a crime writer because the novel that was voted the best ever crime novel by the UK Crime Writers Association some years ago was Josephine Tey's book, The Daughter of Time, whose premise is that Richard III was framed. Many of you were not alive when I started killing people for fun and profit. It's been 36 years now since my first novel, Report for Murder, was published by the Women's Press. It was notable for being the first ever British crime novel with a lesbian protagonist. But there was more fun than profit in it, I have to say. Well, not at the time anyway. On the plus side, though, it's never been out of print in the intervening years. And I'm proud to say I earn more in royalties every year for it than I got in the initial advance back in 1987. Since then, I've done more public events than I can count. They started on a small scale, mostly in public libraries, sometimes in bookshops. I couldn't even dream of an audience this size. Often there was a distinct feeling of speaking to people either sheltering from the rain or having taken pity on me. On one occasion, my audience consisted of 2 librarians and a man with a guide dog. And he left halfway through the reading. On another occasion, I was giving a talk to 20 or so readers in a public library when an elderly woman marched up to me and pushed me aside. For a moment, I thought this might be an extreme version of practical criticism. Then I realized she was trying to get at the books on the shelf behind me to choose one to borrow. On yet another day, I turned up in good time for my 1 o'clock event to find an extremely anxious librarian. Somehow there had been a mix-up. The posters in the library advertised the event would be at 1 p.m, as I expected. But the leaflets in the local paper had announced it would begin at 2 p.m. Would I do it twice, the librarian asked. No, I said, not unless you're going to pay me double. Not out of greed, but on the biblical principle that the labourer is worthy of her hire. We reached a compromise. I'd do the event at 1:30. The people who'd been there at 1 thought I was hideously unpunctual. The second sitting, who wandered in early in dribs and drabs, assumed they'd got it wrong. And I did do an extra long Q&A in the hope that that would keep the customers satisfied. I enjoy these sessions at the end of events, so do have a think about what you might like to ask. Apart from anything else, I'm sick of the sound of my own voice by the time we get to that stage in the proceedings. But I also welcome the insight that comes from hearing readers ask for explanations, talk about the work. Sometimes these questions actually illuminate my own work to me. You readers can see underlying themes and connections that were buried so far in the back of my mind that I didn't know they were there. I remember doing an event about the mermaids singing on one occasion, and a guy in the audience put his hand up and said, "This is a book that's about gender, isn't it? This is a book that's about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman." And I genuinely hadn't thought about that. But as he said those things, I thought, yeah, that's right. I wasn't thinking about that, but it's there in the book. It's not something that's just in his head. It's there, just wasn't in the front of my head when I was writing. And there are, of course, certain questions that come up again and again. Where do you get your ideas from? Will Tony and Carol ever get together? Is Lauren Lyle anything like the Karen Pirie in your head? Do you write with a pencil or straight onto the computer? But the question that comes up more often than any other, framed in many different ways, is how do I get to be a published writer like you? I thought I'd try to answer that in terms of my own life in writing, and hopefully some of what I have to say will strike a chord for you. The first tip I have may seem obvious, and I'll be honest, it's not one you can do anything about in retrospect. Tip number 1, try not to be born into poverty. That probably seems flippant to you, but I'm simply trying to point out how much more difficult it is to succeed if you grow up in a working class environment. For hundreds of years, creatives either came from the moneyed classes or they managed to persuade a patron to fund their work. Shakespeare's father was a wool merchant who also ran a glove-making business. John Milton's father was a wealthy composer. George Eliot's father was a mill owner. Agatha Christie was the daughter of a gentleman who lived on inherited wealth. Anybody not in that privileged position needed somebody who believed in them enough to put their hand in their own pocket to fund the artist's vision. Patronage like that was always easier to come by in music and the visual arts because they're much more immediate than a novel. It was only the arrival of universal free education in the UK that opened the door a crack for ambitious working class wannabes. Slipping through that crack was no easy matter. D.H. Lawrence was an early example of that kind of success, but it took a lot of hard graft to get there. Getting a toe on the ladder was a lot tougher for the son of a Nottingham miner than it was for someone like Virginia Woolf, whose father was a man of letters and a notable mountaineer. I grew up in a working-class family in Fife on the east coast of Scotland. My grandfathers were both miners, and my dad was a welder in the shipyard when I was born. Neither of my parents made it to high school, even though they passed the entrance exam with flying colours. Even if they hadn't needed an extra wage coming into the house, their families couldn't afford the uniforms. My big cousin Senga was the first person in my extended family to go to university. She ended up as a professor in a Russell Group university. I bet there was a regiment of Sengas out there who never got the chance. My mother was the hammer that broke the class ceiling for me. My parents were determined that I should have better life chances than they'd had. Education was the key, they thought, and the place to find that key was in books. And that's my second tip. If you want to be a writer, first become a reader. When I was very small, my mum used to strap me into the pushchair and shove me across the council estate to the branch library, and she would sit and read me picture books before I could read. She'd tell me stories. One of my vivid memories from my childhood is getting the measles when I was 5. And you know how when you've got the measles, you're supposed to be in a darkened room and not have any bright lights. And I remember my mum sitting on a chair in the hall, reading The Wind in the Willows to me as I lay in my darkened room. Probably she thought it was the only way to stop me breaking the door down. But for me, those books were an entree into a completely different world. The prospects for someone like me were quite narrow. And when I was 6 years old, my parents did something quite astonishing for me, but I don't think they did it for me. I think that was a byproduct. We moved house to live opposite the Central Library in Kirkcaldy, where I grew up, and that became my home from home. I would go there pretty much every night after school and change my books, because I could get through 2 novels in a night. You could take out 4 books at a time, but this was Scotland, Presbyterian Scotland, and if you took out 4 books, 2 of them had to be non-fiction. Heaven forfend you should have unmitigated pleasure. But I just read my way around the Shalley School. Edith Blyton, Nancy Drew, Billy Bunter, Biggles, everything. I had no discrimination whatsoever. I wanted to read and read and read. And of course, the thing about library books is you have to take what's on the shelf. You can't go like, oh, well, I want to read the next one in the series. I mean, we're so lucky now. We could just, I'll read the next one in the series. But, it was, I loved the Shalley School books. It's a series of about 50 novels written by Eleanor M. Brentdyer, and they're set in a school that's first in Switzerland, and then first in Austria, then inconveniently the Second World War comes along and the Nazis march in, so they go off to Wales for a while, then they come back to Switzerland, and they speak French one day a week and German one day a week, and it's all just like it was in Fife. And I remember one time saying to my parents, why can't I go to a Swiss boarding school? The hysterical laughter that greeted that one. But the thing about this was that you never got to read them in sequence. So you'd read book number 27, then number 3, and then number 46. And so there was like this giant 3D jigsaw in my head, trying to figure out where everything fit together. And sometimes you'd have these moments of absolute illumination, epiphanies, where you'd go, that's why she behaves like that. But those books taught me an awful lot about writing series. They taught me that, if you read the Enid Blyton Famous Five or whatever, it doesn't matter what order you read them in. They all happen in the same sempiternal summer. They all go to Cairn Island, the same sempiternal summer, the sun shines, and they never learn. They never go, we better not go into that dark cave, because the last time we went into a dark cave, something terrible happened. But the thing I loved about the Shalley School book was that things had consequences. If you broke your leg tobogganing, you were still limping 3 books later. And I loved that sense of reading on and finding out how characters were changed by what had happened to them and what that led to further down the line. So that was, in a way, although I wouldn't have understood it at the time, a lesson in writing series fiction, that your characters have to embrace what's happened to them and take it into themselves, and that it changes their future. The other thing that I learned, as a very valuable lesson, was that writing was a job. One of the characters grows up to become a writer of girls' school stories in a way that feels quite meta now, but at the time it just happened, you know. And in one book, she gets a letter from her publisher, and I remember it was halfway down the page on the right-hand side, and she opens this letter, and there's a cheque in it. And I was probably about 9 years old, and I thought, oh my God, this is a job. You get paid money for this. I could do that. I can tell lies. And that was the point where my ambition was formed. I decided at that point I was going to be a writer, and that was something I was going to do. But the road I travelled is not without its problems these days. And the people who run the country don't really want people reading, because reading leads to thinking, and thinking provokes change. So let's close the libraries and stop people's free access to books. Let them think that the only route to wider horizons is Love Island. All over the country, I don't have to tell you this, all over the country, libraries are closing. I don't blame cash-strapped local authorities who have heartbreaking choices forced on them about what services to cut. I blame the privileged class whose primary concerns are preserving their own privilege. The one thing, though, that are far more of now than when I was growing up are charity shops. Many charities now run specialist book chains, and that's one way to make a little money go a long way. In my day, though, there were many more second-hand bookshops, and one of them, for me, that I just loved when I went to Oxford was Jeremy's 10p bookshop. At the bottom of the Cowley Road, everything was 10p. And I just read my way around that the way I'd read my way around the library, because the great thing with Jeremy's is you could take the book back and you got 5p against your next book. So my next tip really comes from those days, and it's to write what you're passionate about. We're often told to write what we know. But honestly, how many books do you think I'd have got out of being a wee fat Scottish lesbian? I wanted to write about what I didn't know at first hand. I wanted an excuse to explore the world outside my window. I wanted an excuse to go and talk to people about what they did. And I discovered that passion early on in my childhood. I used to spend a lot of time at my grandparents' house. They lived in a mining village just along the coast from Kirkcaldy. And they were not readers. They took the Daily Express, for God's sake, you know. They were not readers. And there were only 2 books in the house. There was a copy of the Bible, of course. And the other one was The Murder at the Vicarage by Agatha Christie. I do not know why they had The Murder at the Vicarage. I think someone must have left it behind when they were visiting. But it was the only other book they had, and so I'd turn up on a Friday night with my 2 library books under my arm, and I'd run out of them by Saturday lunchtime, so I'd read The Murder at the Vicarage. One of the things that the linguistic scientists tell us is that you can read Christie with a reading age of 9, and so I was reading The Murder at the Vicarage from the age of 9. And I loved that book. I didn't understand at the time why I loved it, but I understand now because it's so perfectly constructed. It's a real masterpiece of structure. There's an overarching story of the murder at the vicarage, but there's lots of subplots going on, and they've all got a setup, development, payoff. So there's always something going on that makes you turn the page because you want to know what happens next, but she doesn't give you what happens next in that story. She gives you something else to draw you in right through the book. Now, obviously, I didn't understand that at 9, but I just loved the way it all fitted together. And it didn't matter how many times I read it, it still charmed me. Even though I didn't really understand what the adult relationships were about. I mean, what was an affair? Didn't have affairs in Fife. and it had 0 relationship to my life, you know. I mean, it might as well have been science fiction. You know, I knew Scottish mining villages. I did not understand the villages of England. We did not have retired colonels of the Indian Army or little old ladies with herbaceous borders. The little old ladies in the village that I knew would mostly be down the pub trying to get their husband out before he spent all their wages. But Agatha was my gateway drug. I was so delighted when I read in the front cover of the book that she'd written more than one book. And I wanted to read the rest of them. I wanted to get my hands on these books. But I couldn't get them because they were in the adult library. And it's not like today when you go in the library and all the books are on open access shelves. In Kirkcaldy Library at that time, there was a wall between the children's library and the adult library. And frankly, it would probably have been easier to get over the Berlin Wall than that. So those librarians were tough. And I didn't know what to do. So I'm afraid that Agatha led me into a life of crime. And I stole my mum's library tickets. And I went over to the library and I put on my most pitiful face, said to her, I have to get a book for my mum. She's not well. And God bless those lovely librarians, it worked for 5 years. Till I could get my own adult tickets. Again, I was fortunate, in that the Kirkcaldy Library had a very good crime fiction section, and by this time I had decided crime fiction was my bag. As well as anything else that I was reading, there was always a crime novel on the go. But if there's one thing that's a common thread running through my novels, it's the sense that you can't outrun your past. The sins of your past always catch up with you. And a few years ago, I was doing an event at Kirkcaldy Library, and my mum still lived across the road from the library. And I said to her, why don't you come along tonight, see what I do for a living, And she said, oh, well, I'll come along then. And to my astonishment, a couple of the women who'd been librarians when I was wee were there. And I thought they were ancient. They were probably about 23. So I introduced my mother, and one of them looked very surprised. She said, oh, Mrs. McDermid, I thought you must be dead. And my mum goes, dead? Why would I be dead? And the librarian goes, well, with you being a bedridden invalid all those years. You know that look that only your mother can give you. Yeah. So, anyway, back then when I was lying to the librarians, I was a teenager, and people asked me what I was going to do when I grew up. And I would say, a writer, I'm going to write books. Everybody laughed. And I mean everybody. Even the English teacher who gave up his free periods to coach me for the Oxford entrance exam, studying texts that weren't on the Scottish syllabus that I'd be expected to be familiar with, even he couldn't hide a smile. As people like us didn't write books. I didn't know anybody who wrote books. I had friends who were singer-songwriters on the folk scene, but there's a big difference between 4 verses and a chorus and a novel. There weren't book festivals or events like this where I could listen to writers talk about their lives and careers. The nearest I came to that was getting a book of Norman McCaig's poetry signed when he was speaking at the local Burns Club supper. It was a men-only event, but my dad was a singer with the concert party, and he knew I was a massive fan of McCaig, so he took along one of my books for him to autograph. Not only did people like us not write books, we seldom saw ourselves in books. We were the barely visible servants and foot soldiers, sidekicks of the posh detective inspectors, nannies and cooks, keepers of the village shop or the village pub. Too insignificant even to be serious suspects in the world of fictional murder. Add to that the intersection with being queer. Why did it take till 1987 for someone to publish a novel with a lesbian protagonist in this, the most popular of genres? All I saw in fiction was fragments of myself, splinters in a broken mirror. It seemed to me then, and it still does now, that so many lives are missing in our literature. When we do show up, we're corralled in a niche, dismissed as genre fiction, as if literary fiction isn't just another genre. I wanted to write books that showed the complexities of our lives, the strengths and the weaknesses, the resilience as well as the vulnerabilities, the communities and the support systems as well as the stresses and failures. There's a lot more to working class and queer lives than pain, poverty, addiction, violence, despair, and suicide. I was determined not to perpetuate one-dimensional or stereotypical characterization of people like me. Now, one of the reasons I ended up at Oxford was that it seemed to me to produce a lot of writers. It was also one of the 3 places that the lassies from the Shalley School went after school. Number 1 was the Sorbonne. I knew my French wasn't good enough for that. And then there was Oxford, and then there was the Kensington School of Needlework. So Oxford got by vote. I sat the entrance exam at 16, and somehow I managed to persuade them to take me on. It was a profound culture shock. For a start, they didn't kind of word I was saying, because I spoke like that. I spoke, come for five, and we talk awfully fast. Come for five, well, the spjugs fly backwards to keep the stew out of the rain, Ken. When I had my first tutorial, I started reading out my essay, and I was about 2 paragraphs in, and my tutor stopped me and said, "I'm terribly sorry, Miss McDermid, I haven't understood a word you've said. Might you go back to the beginning and perhaps a little more slowly this time?" So what I learned first was that I had to learn to speak English. And I now have what my partner calls my Radio 4 Scottish accent. Only sometimes it slips a bit. First time we went to a football match together, I arrived at the ground and said, "Oh, we're going to be all right today. You think we'll get a win? Ken will win. Ken, what do you think? Who's playing, Ken?" And she said, "I thought you'd had a stroke." It wasn't just the accent, everything was different. Scotland in the late 1960s, early 1970s was a foreign country. I mean, even more foreign than it is now. You know, we had different vegetables. We only had 3 vegetables. You know, we had onions and totties and turnips, occasionally a carrot. And I would sit down at dinner sometimes and just not know if what was being put in front of me was a table decoration or food. I remember the first time we went to an Italian restaurant, I looked at this menu, I thought, I don't know what any of these things are. Pizza, I know what pizza is. Get that at the chip shop. So the waiter arrived with this round flat thing with tomatoes and vegetables on it, and I said, "That's not a pizza." And he said, "What do you mean that's not a pizza?" I said, "That's not a pizza." I said, Of course it's a pizza. You know, we're Italian, we know what a pizza is." I said, "No, a pizza's half moon-shaped and covered in batter." So I had some difficulties adjusting, but I did adjust because I was determined that these people had the keys to the kingdom and I wasn't going to leave until I'd wrested them out of their dead hands. But I loved my course. I loved the cut and thrust of discussion and intellectual debate and the chance to articulate what I thought about what I was reading. But there was no nourishment for creativity in it. I knew I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know how. I still didn't know how. And you'd have to have a job because people like us didn't get to be writers straight out the starting blocks. I went to the careers fair and I knew I wasn't going to be a civil servant. And all the jobs to me seemed to be things that I couldn't do because I'm not very good at routine. I've got a very low boredom threshold. And the thought of going to an office and doing the same thing basically every day made me just want to run and hide. And also not very good at hierarchies, so I didn't really want to do something where you did a job for a while and then you got the next step up the ladder. And the only thing that seemed to make sense to me was journalism, because it wasn't the same thing every day, and you got to do different things. You got to go out into the world and meet different people and hear their stories. So I thought that would be probably quite a good idea, and I was lucky enough to score a place on the Mirror Group training scheme, where I had to go and work in Devon for 2 years, doing local papers and going to parish councils and magistrates' courts. And I was scarred for life by parish councils, honest to God. I remember spending at one parish council where they spent an hour discussing what they were going to do with the inside of the bus shelter. Were they going to just paint it? Were they going to put Artex on it? Well, the problem with Artex is the sheep would just come in and rub themselves on it and it would get dirt. You wouldn't believe this. But I stuck with it and because I needed to. It was my job. And the one thing about it, both there and when I subsequently went on to work for the Daily Record in Glasgow and then in Manchester, the one thing about it was that it taught me that writing is a job. It's not something where you can wait for the muse to strike. If you're serious about being a writer, you have to treat it as a job. You sit at your desk and you do it, because you can't let what's going on in your life, what's going on in the day-to-day, come between you and your job. You can't go to a news editor and say, "I don't feel like doing that train crash today because my cat's just died. I'll do it tomorrow maybe." No, you have to do it here and now. And I learned very quickly that whatever's going on in your life, you can always put something down on paper. And if you have something down on paper, you can make it better. You can polish it. You can go back to it. And so that was, probably the first lesson I learned from journalism. And the other thing I took away from journalism was a great data set of characters. And I was always a general reporter, so I met all kinds of people, all kinds of situations, usually when something quite bad had happened in their lives, but sometimes when something miraculous and wonderful had happened. And you see people in crisis, and it's like the fast track to what they're really like. And I interviewed hundreds of people over the years in their homes, in their workplaces, in their leisure activities, And I saw all kinds of people in all kinds of situations, and this gave me this huge data set of characters. So now whenever I'm thinking about somebody and thinking, why would they do this? What kind of person would do this? I just kind of flick through the card index in my head and think, oh, I remember so-and-so. And that gives me a way in. It reminds me of a conversation, of an interaction that I had, and that is a starting point. Of course, although I was working as a journalist, I was also writing the great English novel, because that's when you do when you're 20 and you've graduated and you know the secrets of the universe. Because nobody can tell you anything at 20 because you know everything. I wrote this terrible first novel, and the one thing I will say about it was that I finished it. And I sent it to pretty much every publishing house I could find in the Writers and Artists Yearbook, and they all sent it back very promptly. There was none of that hanging on to it for 3 months and then sending it back and saying, we're very intrigued by your novel, we'd like to see what you write next. No, I just got it sent back to me. But I wasn't downhearted, because I'd read about writers having books that were turned down by 20 publishers, then went on to win the Booker Prize or something. But I wrote this novel and it wasn't going anywhere, so I started to write a second novel that wasn't really going anywhere. But in the meantime, I showed it to a friend of mine who was an actor, and she said, I don't know much about novels, but I think this would make a good play. So I thought, play, that's easy, you just cross out the descriptions, leave in the speaky bits, it's a play. And that's more or less what I did. I wrote some extra scenes to cover the bits I'd crossed out. And then I went off to the local theatre company. I was working in Plymouth at the time. And this is one of those sort of things where, I was starting to make one or two connections along the way. And the ex-boyfriend of my best friend's sister was the director of the local theatre company. And I'd met him at a couple of parties. So I showed the play to him, and he decided that he was doing a series of new plays in the studio theatre, and he wanted to do my play. He didn't do it as a favour, as such, but because he knew me, it climbed to the top of the pile, and he paid attention to it. He wouldn't have put it on if it had been a bag of shite, but he clearly thought there was something to it. And so there I was, at the age of 23, completely accidentally a professionally performed playwright. I thought I was going to be the next Harold Pinter, because I could do pauses. And I adapted this for BBC Radio, and I also got myself an agent in the process of that. I kept on trying to write plays, and I kept on failing disastrously because I didn't know what I'd done right. I didn't understand how a play worked, and there was nothing like you couldn't pop off to an Arvin course really and learn how to do it. I didn't know how to find out how to write plays, how to understand dramatic structure. So I just kept trying to write these plays and writing terrible plays. And eventually, after a couple of years, I got sacked by my agent because I wasn't making him any money. And that was a very low point for me, because if the one person who stands to make money off of you dumps you, you're probably not very good. But I was determined. I still wanted to be a writer. There was something in me that said, you can do this, and this is what you need to be. And along the way, one of the books that I'd read was a book by William McIlvanney called Laidlaw, which is a Scottish crime novel written in the late 1970s. And I'd never read anything like this at the time that I read Laidlaw. It was set in Glasgow, written with the language of the street. The people in that book spoke like real people spoke. And I'd never seen a crime novel that was set in a world that I knew, that I understood. And that was, for me, was a real sort of opening of the door a wee crack. But at the time, I didn't know how to capitalize on that, how to make it a starting point. And the thing that really for me opened the door was, there was at that time, I'm talking about the early 1980s, and there was the start of what was called the new feminist wave of private eye novels. So writers like Sarah Paretsky, Sue Grafton, Marcia Muller, Mary Wings, Barbara Wilson were writing these novels with feminist protagonists, women with agency, women who had a brain and a sense of humour and didn't have to get the guys in to do the heavy lifting, who could actually do stuff themselves. And the other thing I loved about these books was the sense of place in them. I really felt that I'd been taken to a different city that I could imagine in my head. And these books had that sense of, this story could only happen here because these lives are embedded in the place. And I thought, that's what I want to write. And so that kind of kick-started me into the idea that became Report for Murder. I was I had a full-time job at the time. I was a reporter on a Sunday newspaper. And so Mondays were my day off. And I wrote on Monday afternoons. I'll go for a walk on a Monday morning and start think about what I was going to do on the Monday afternoon. 2 o'clock till 7 o'clock, I wrote. And I didn't answer the phone, I didn't answer the door. Everybody was still laughing, by the way. But I was writing. And it was curiously productive because all week I was thinking about what I'd done the week before and what needed to be changed and how I needed to shift what I'd done and what I was going to write next. I'd be rehearsing dialogue. I'd be having conversations in my head between the characters and figuring out how that next scene was going to play out. So Monday afternoons, I was writing, and after a couple of years, I had the first draft of a novel. But I still didn't know how it worked. What is an agent? Could you get published without one? How do I find the right one for me? What is an acquisitions meeting? How do I put together a good synopsis? What if my 3 chapters are too long or too short or just too rubbish? But again, I had a very remote connection. A pair of my pals from Oxford were living in a shared house in North London. I'd go up to parties at the weekend from Plymouth because Plymouth was boring as fuck in those days. And one of the other women in the house had a girlfriend who worked at the Women's Press. I asked her how I should go about getting published, and she offered to pass it on to one of the editors. Again, they wouldn't have published it, they wouldn't have made an offer on it if they hadn't thought it was good enough. But because it came from somebody that they knew, it got looked at. So here's the next tip. Never pass up the chance to make a connection. Those indirect links are not a motorway to success, but they can get you onto the slip road. Talk to people at parties, talk to people in bookshops, talk to people at book events. Just make those wee connections, and those wee connections can lead you on the start of the road to something big. Now, when Report for Murder was published, I thought my life was going to change. I thought people would be stopping me in the street going, "It's Val McDermid, the novelist. How extraordinary." And that's not quite how it happened. Back in the day, in those days, Women's Press were published paperback originals. And some of you may remember that back then, paperbacks didn't get reviewed at all in the review pages of the papers and magazines. So Lindsay got published into echoing silence. But what happened was 1 or 2 people started to read the books, and they said to their friends, "You should read this, I think you'll enjoy it." And some booksellers read the books and pressed it into the hands of their customers saying, "You're going to like this." 1 or 2 librarians read it and said, "You're going to like this." And that was an extraordinary experience to me, that the word spread and people started reading this. And every now and again, I got invited to talk to people sometimes. Not many people, and not very often, but I did occasionally get invited to talk to people. And I planned to write a trilogy of books with Lindsay Gordon, and that trilogy basically got me an agent. After the first book came out, I got a letter from the people who became my first agent, and they said, "We're a new agency starting up. We're looking for clients. We're writing to everyone who's published a debut novel this year that we think is any good. If you've not got an agent, come and talk to us." So I went and talked to them. At the time, they were operating out of Jane Gregory's attic. And I had this conversation with them, and Lisanne, who did the editorial side of things, said, "There's one good sentence in this book." More significant than that probably was that the dogs liked me. You know, one of the dogs put his head on my knee, the other one sat on my feet. So that was the dogs were generally thought to be good judges of literary merit. And from that, as I say, I got an agent. My agent, Jane Gregory, retired at the end of last year after agenting me for 35 years, which is longer than many marriages, I have to say, and probably had fewer arguments. I was still working as a journalist, I say, back then, but I was increasingly depressed about what was happening in tabloid journalism. I'd gone into tabloid journalism with that sort of idealistic view that working people deserved newspapers that were informative as well as entertaining. Boy, was I on the wrong side of history on that one. And by that time, I was working for Robert Maxwell. I was a trade union official, and I was having to deal directly with Robert Maxwell, which was no fun at all. And I thought, I need to dig the tunnel to get me out of this. And it's not going to be writing more niche novels like Lindsay Gordon. they were selling, but they weren't selling in the kind of numbers that could support me. And so I thought, I wrote the 3 novels that I'd planned to write. It's now a 6-book trilogy, by the way. But I then started writing the Kate Brannigan novels for 3 reasons, really. Partly it was because I wanted to stretch myself as a writer. Lindsay Gordon was quite close in many respects to the life I was leading. She was Scottish, she was a lesbian, she was a journalist. She's definitely not me, but I could use the facts of my life and my experience to write about her life. I wanted to write something that was very different, and so I decided to write a private eye novel. I knew nothing really about private eyes, but I thought I could make it up. And she's straight, and she's in Manchester, and she's very different from me, as I say. In fact, when I started writing full-time, I was writing 2 Brannigans back-to-back, and I realised at that point I couldn't write 2 books back-to-back with the same characters, because halfway through the second book I wanted to kill her. She was smarter than me, she was thinner than me, she was funnier than me, she was better at computer games than me. Why was I hanging out with this woman? But that was the first reason. I wanted to push myself to see if I could stretch myself and be a different kind of writer. I also, quite frankly, wanted to find a mainstream publisher so that I might possibly one day be able to support myself with my writing. And the third reason was the subversive one. As I don't know about you guys, but most of the crime readers I know, if you find a new writer that you like, you want to go right back to the beginning and read everything they've written. And I figured the best way to get people to read my Lindsay Gordon novels was to get them to enjoy the Kate Brannigans. So that was the plan. And that kind of worked, because every time one of the Brannigans came out, we'd see a wee peak in the Lindsay Gordon sales, which was very pleasing. And so I went off I was down to London to find a publisher with my agents, and I met up with an editor called Julia Wisdom, who's still at HarperCollins, and that first meeting she said, "I have no desire to write a book." I thought, thank you, you'll do me, because having a writer who wants to write a book and hasn't been able to write a book is quite often disastrous, because they want you to write their book for them, rather than for you to make your book the best it can be. And as I say, I learned very quickly that I couldn't write 2 books back-to-back with the same characters. So I needed to add to my stable, if you like, of characters, not just Lindsay and Kate. At the time, I was reading quite a lot of American crime fiction as well, and I'd read the early Thomas Harris books, and I thought the idea of profiling was interesting. And I acquired the FBI Handbook of Sexual Homicide. It was my bedtime reading for some time. Girlfriends give you a very strange look when that's what you're reading at bedtime. But I thought it would be interesting to maybe think about writing a book about a profiler. And in a strange experience that's never happened to me before or since, I was driving down the M6 from Carlisle to Manchester, and the radio was on. I was listening vaguely to Woman's Hour, and out of nowhere, an entire plot fell into my head. I had the idea for The Mermaid Singing, and it came to me in a wonder. I knew who the main characters were, I knew what their relationship was, I knew who the killer was, I knew who they were killing and why, and I knew how they were getting away with it. And this has never happened to me before or since, as I say. And I literally pulled over onto the hard shoulder. I know you're only supposed to do that in an emergency, but this was a narrative emergency. I didn't want to lose this story, and so I scribbled down some notes in my notebook. And by the time I got home, I was completely on fire about this idea. My main problem was I didn't know anybody who did profiling. I didn't know anything about profiling in the UK. And I started sort of looking into this and discovered very quickly that it was a very different process from what they do in America, where they train up FBI agents in what they call behavioral science. In this country, what we do is the police work with clinical psychologists on a case-by-case basis, because we don't have enough serial offenders, serial killers, serial rapists, or they don't think we have, to make it worthwhile having specialist units. And so I got even more excited by this, because I thought right away there you've got a tension between the police and the psychologists, because the police never like being told what to do. Should have noticed this weekend. And I thought if I make my profiler's contact with the police a woman, that gives us another source of potential tension. So it was all starting to take shape in my head, but I knew bugger all about the business of profiling. And I didn't know how to find somebody who did. And then one night, and another thing that I would say is never misjudge the possibilities of serendipity. I was watching the local news, and an interview came on with a guy who was a clinical psychologist in the local secure mental hospital, and he was talking about profiling for the police. I go, yes! I scribbled down his name and where he worked, and the next day I rang him up. I said, I was watching on the television last night, and I'm a writer, and I want to write a book about a profiler. Can I come and talk to you? And he said, silence. So then he said, Alja, I know you're not a nutter. And it was a fairly reasonable question, given how over-enthusiastic I'd been. I said, well, I'll send you one of my books, and maybe you could read it and decide if I'm a nutter. So I sent him a couple of books, and time went by, and I heard nothing from him. I thought, he thinks I'm a nutter. And eventually, after about 2.5 months, the phone rang, and it was him. And he said, I've read your books, and my wife's read your books, and we don't think you're a nutter. So shall we have lunch? So I went and bought him lunch, and he talked to me about what he did and explained to me the nuts and bolts of putting together a profile. And we got to know each other, and over time, he took me through his method, and he actually took me into his office inside the secure mental hospital, which was slightly unsettling, because I thought, I'm sure he doesn't think I'm a nutter. But he took me through a couple of live profiles in confidence, obviously, that he was working on. And from that, I learned how he did it. And that became Tony Hill's method and remained Tony Hill's method for 11 books. It was my first direct experience of working with somebody in forensic science, although I'd kept an eye on what was going on in that world. And it's quite nice to be here in Leicester, where we got the development of DNA profiling, because the first case involving DNA was in 1986. My first book came out in 1987, and I feel like my career has gone in lockstep with forensics ever since. And I've made many good friends along the years who are forensic scientists, particularly Professor Sue Black, who has been immensely helpful to me. But that particular instance, I sat down and I started writing this book, and I really didn't know if it was any good. I did not have any sense of whether it was a good novel or just a pile of words, many of them different. And I finished it and sent it off to my agent, and she thought it was marvelous, and sent it to my editor. She thought it was marvelous. And it won the Gold Dagger for the best crime novel of the year, and I was completely and utterly gobsmacked by that. It was the last thing I expected. But it was something that really made a big difference to me. And the tip that I suppose I would take from that is you have to be patient. It's not necessarily going to happen instantly. I mean, Ian Rankin and I always laugh that it took us 10 years to be an overnight sensation. And really, that's been a process of learning our craft. I would not go back and rewrite those early novels, but when I read them now, I kind of wince at the sort of, bad bits of plotting or uncomfortable bits of dialogue. I think I'm a bit better now, The next thing that came along that I think that really made a difference and also taught me about patience is that books don't necessarily come to you at once. They don't all come like The Mermaid Singing. Sometimes a book can take years from having that first idea and a sense of what the plot is and what the story is before you can actually get it to come together and find the structure or whatever. I mean, for me, the classic example of that was a book called A Place of Execution. When I moved to Derbyshire in 1979, I fell in love with the Peak District, particularly the White Peak. And I used to spend every weekend out there in the hills and the dales. And what I loved about it was the sense of mysteriousness and strangeness about it. It's a quarter of the population was within an hour's drive of the Peak District. And you could go there on a bank holiday Monday and not see another living soul up some of the smaller, more remote dales. And I just thought anything could happen here. But I couldn't find the story. I thought, I can't have this just with Tony Hill or Kate Brannigan turning up as a visiting fireman. It's not going to work. It's not going to let me tell the story the way I want to tell it. And for ages, I just couldn't figure it out. And then, again, a bit of serendipity. I was reading some W.H. Auden, and he has a wonderful long poem called In Praise of Limestone. And he's writing about Tuscany, not about Derbyshire. But it had many resonances for me. And he was talking about these remote places in the limestone landscape. And there was just a great line in it that just banged inside my head. It said, and when one of them goes to the bad, we all understand why. And I thought, this needs to be in a small community, and it needs to be a story that could only happen here. It's got to be very place-specific and very society-specific, if you like. It's got to be about these people in this place. I still didn't have a story, but I now understood the kind of story that I wanted to write. And the final bit in the jigsaw came when I was doing an event with a true crime writer in Hull, and he was talking about no-body cases where people have been found guilty of murder where there was no body. And I thought, that's what I could do. So that on the way home, I was like full of ideas for how I could write this book, and that took really probably 20 years from having that first sense of I really want to write a book that's set here in one of these places to actually writing it. I'd say that taught me the lessons of patience. If you have an idea that keeps singing in your head, eventually you'll find a way to tell the story. It happened to me with another book called Trick of the Dark. I was in Oxford again at my old college, and there was a wedding happening in the grounds. I was at a conference there, and I got bored and went and sat in the grounds. And I saw the bride and the family of the bride arriving, and I realized that I recognized the mother of the bride as someone who had taught me. And I used to babysit for her kids. So this was one of the kids that had grown up and was having their wedding. And I thought, that was really interesting. I thought, what could possibly be the consequences of that kind of meeting again after those years? What could happen? What could be the story? And by the end of the weekend, I knew that the bridegroom was going to be dead by bedtime. But again, it took me a long time to find the structure for that. I knew the story roughly, but I couldn't find the way to tell it. So sometimes you just have to sit with something and leave it for now. And it's the same thing with, you've got to the next tip I would say is knowing when to let go. That happens in a sort of macro sense of when you write a series and you come to the point where you think, I have to stop this. And a lot of times I think writers get to the point where they think, I have to stop this, and they don't. And that's, it's hard to let go of what is in many ways your meal ticket, but sometimes you just have to grit your teeth and say, I'm going somewhere else with this. I'm going somewhere else. I can write a different character. I can go in a different direction. And I've always kind of reinvented what I was doing, and I've always found new ways to tell the stories I want to tell. And for me, that's been a really important part of what feels to me like developing as a writer, to go in different ways and to write different kinds of stories. And on a micro sense, knowing when to let go is knowing when you have to stop and give it to your editor. And that's hard as well, because however good you are, you always know in your heart that the book has got problems, that there are bits and things that are not working. And you reach a point where you think, I know this isn't working, but I don't know how to fix it. I need another pair of eyes on this. And that's what trusting your editor is about, because their only job is to help you make your book better. Everything else flows from that. But when they help you to make your book better, it really fills you with confidence that somebody has taken the time and the trouble to figure out where the problems lie. And I find in my experience, when my editor points out what she thinks the problems are, they're always the places that I already know are problems. And we talk about that, and in the process of talking about it and discussing it, I find the answers. As I say, their main job is to help you make your book as good as it can be. And it's always worth listening, and it's always worth knowing when to let go. Now, I was lucky to arrive in the crime genre at a time when people were pushing the envelope. When I started, there was only really police procedurals and village mysteries in the UK crime writing pantheon. And over the years, that has expanded enormously. There's now, I think, nothing you can't write about within the scope of a crime novel. Psychological suspense, historical suspense. It's not the parlour game anymore. It explores all sorts of issues and questions. Whatever you want to write about, you can find a way to bring it into the crime novel. And that's quite a fun thing, because you're actually going to sell more novels than more copies than writing a very serious literary novel about that thing that really bothers you. If you can put a dead body in the middle of it, it'll do a lot better. But it's as I say, when I started, it was also very metropolitan. But at the same time as I started writing, there were other writers writing more regionally as well. Ian Rankin setting his books in Edinburgh, John Harvey setting his books in Nottingham, Martin Edwards setting his books in Liverpool. And that also changed the shape of what was coming out, because it wasn't any longer about middle-class people in North London or in a small village in the home counties. It made the books gave the books more scope. And that also made it possible for writers to write different kinds of books. Most of the books that I've been writing for the last 20 years wouldn't have been published probably in the 1980s, because they just didn't fit the pattern. Now that there isn't a pattern. I mean, you get trends. You get there was an awful lot of books about girls for a while. The girl on the train, the girl on the bus from Lesmahago. So there's always trends. But if you've got something to say, you don't have to write something that fits a trend now. You don't have to say, this is the kind of book that people are buying, because frankly, by the time you've written the book, they'll be buying something else. It's always important to write the things that you've got a passion for. And in a way, that's brought me back to where I started, because my last couple of novels have been 1979 and 1989, and back about being a journalist, back in those days of working in a newsroom. And I started writing them. The intention is to write 5 books, a quintet. I started writing them because I finished the previous book, Still Life, right at the start of COVID. We were in lockdown. And I couldn't write in the here and now. All my books, one way or another, are set in the here and now. And there was no solid ground to stand on. Remember what it was like in March 2020. We didn't know what the next day would bring, never mind the next week. We didn't know if this was going to be the pandemic that saw us off. We didn't know how many lives were going to be afflicted by this or how they were going to be afflicted by this. And I didn't know how to write about that. And so I thought I need to write about something where I do know what it was like. I do know the truth of what happened, or my truth. And I thought it was also, the other thing that was in my head was that my publisher's been going, yap, write a memoir. And I thought, I don't want to write a memoir. A lot of people would have to die before I could escape the libel laws. But also, I didn't want to stare at my own navel for a couple of years, because I've got other stories to tell. I've got other interesting things to say. And so I thought, if I wrote a series of novels with the same central character over a period of like 40-odd years, that would be interesting for me to write and hopefully be interesting for people to read. And I'd be able to use my own experiences and steal my own anecdotes and steal the anecdotes of all my friends and wrap it up in a series of novels that would have a murder in them, but would also be about what life was like in those years. And so I wrote 1979, and then I wrote 1989, and then I thought I need something else to do, because I had a Karen Pirie novel banging at the back of my head. So when I was in New Zealand last year, I wrote Karen Pirie. So this year's book's going to be a Karen Pirie, but next year will be 1999. And now I'm starting to think about that, and that's fizzing in my head. And for ages, I couldn't figure out what's the story here, what's the story here, what's the story here. And then I had a conversation 2 weeks ago, and I just thought, that's the story here. So now I know where the heart of that story is. And so I'm really excited, because I've got lots of research to do and lots of things to read and lots of people to talk to. And that's back to where I started and what I love to do, which is to explore the world outside my window, not just to be writing about what's happening like in my wee world. So I guess the final thing I would say is, don't give up. I mean, there have been times over the years when I've felt despondent and despairing, times when I almost believed that the ones who laughed were the ones who were right. Monday afternoons when the sun shone and the hills beckoned, more tempting than a third pass at chapter 17. Still, there are times when I struggle with an intransigent plot that won't be subjugated to my will. Still, there are times when I can't figure out how to make sense of something. And then I remind myself that I am unemployable. But more importantly, that I'm doing the thing I love more than anything else. That I'm making a living in spite of the odds stacked against me at the start. That people like you find something in my work that touches them. I was at an event a couple of weeks ago, organised by Diva magazine, and in the course of that, an army officer came up to me, and she was on the point of tears, and she said, "I read one of your books 10 years ago, and I was in a really bad marriage at the time, and somehow something in that book said to me, your life could be different." She said, "And my life is completely different 10 years on, and that's down to you and your book." And I'm going, "Probably isn't, you know. You're probably going to do it anyway." But for her, that was something that had meant so much and meant a lot to her. And it certainly meant a lot to me. So remember that your story and your words are important, and the world needs to hear them. So many of us come from backgrounds where we're told our imaginations are not wanted, not needed, not respected. Well, I say bollocks to that. In the same way that cats are obligate carnivores, some of us are obligate writers. We tell our stories because we can't not tell them, and we should never apologize for that. Thank you. We've got a couple of people with roving mics, so if you want to put your hands up if you have a question, and if you can wait till the person arrives with you to the mic, yeah? So over here, thanks.
Is that something?
Just
Yes.
speak.
Yes, great lecture. Thank you very much. You said that if writing's your job, you've got to make yourself do it, and you can't just wait for inspiration. But on the other hand, you were saying that sometimes you do have to wait till the plot comes to you in a particular setting or when you're driving or whatever. So how do you reconcile those two different ways of doing things?
Write something else at the time. I mean, when these things happen to me, when I think about something else, when something goes ping in my head, I'm usually writing something else at the time. This is the next thing, or the next thing. When I'm actually in the thick of writing a book, then that is what I'm totally focused on. And there are bits sometimes when you just think, I'm not quite sure how the next bit goes. I'm not sure, don't know quite how to negotiate this bit. And that's when I do my going to the supermarket writing. So if I don't know where the next bit is, but I know kind of what the bit after that is, where I have to get to, I'll take my character to the washing machine or the supermarket and basically have them doing their messages or doing some other task. The process of writing from their point of view in their world gradually takes you to the place where the next step becomes possible and becomes clear. But I'm sorry I didn't make that clear, but there's a queue of things in the back of my head that are in small pieces that start to come together. Like this 1999, I've not started writing that yet, so it's lovely to have that moment where now I know where I'm going with that. So you have to be patient for the ideas to take shape. Sometimes you have a great idea, but you don't know how to write it yet. So you park it and do something else. The more you worry at it, the more intransigent it becomes. Yes.
Thanks, Val. That was great. I really enjoyed it. You talked a lot about the importance of, capturing your own passions, but I wonder how the passions of people around you rub off in your writing as well. And I say that very specifically as a recovering academic geographer. I'm really familiar with Joe's writing. And I can see traces of Joe's passions in some of the recent books.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't read The Skeleton Road and not see Joe's fingerprints all over it. I'm a writer. I plunder other people's lives. I'm a vampire. If you're a writer, you soak everything out of your own life, and then you soak everything out of everybody else's life that you know. If you think you can make something of it, you take it. And mostly people don't recognize themselves. But yeah, I'll just take anything I can find. I'm a snapper up of unconsidered trifles. So be careful what you say. There's somebody over here.
Thank you very much for the talk. Just wanted to, you mentioned American crime writing and how you were grabbed by it at one stage. Maybe you still are. I love American crime writing. Who are your favourite American crime writers up to today and from the past?
Well, I remember when I started reading American crime writers, I was very taken with Dashiell Hammett. because I think Chandler is a wonderful writer, but he doesn't understand women at all. I mean, there's a bit in The Long Goodbye where he has like this 2-page rant about blondes. And clearly somebody had really upset him. But the thing about Hammett is that his women are real. There's a bit in Red Harvest where he talks about the woman who's the complete siren that everybody falls in love with, and you expect some blonde bombshell to come up. And when she shows up in the book, her lipstick's smeared, and she's got a ladder in her stockings. She's a flesh and blood woman, in other words. So I liked of the sort of Dashiell Hammett and Chandler. I think I would have enjoyed Hammett's company more, certainly. But other American writers that I really enjoyed over the years, Joseph Brandstetter, I think, is a really superb craftsman and writes really well. God, my brain's gone to sleep. Sarah Paretsky, of course, remains somebody that's a real benchmark for me. Sorry, I was going to say. It's gone completely out of my head. I'm sorry. But there's a huge range, and I like a lot of writers from around the world. I like, for example, in Australia, I love Michael Rowbotham's work, and I think Harlan Coben is a good thriller writer. I've enjoyed his work right from the early days when he was writing about the Myron Bolitar, the sports agent. So there's huge stuff for everything. Any kind of story that you like, you'll find someone who's writing it well. Michael Connelly is still very hard to beat in terms of the police detective stories. I think he's still writing at the top of his game. So there's so much to discover there. Thanks. Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
You've been very funny. It's been very entertaining.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask about your family support. What do your mum and dad say?
Well, they're dead now, so they don't say very much.
Were they here when you made it?
Very sadly, my dad died 10 days before my first book came out. So he never read it. He'd seen the cover, but he never held the book in his hands. My mum read the books with great pleasure and avidity. She told everybody else how proud she was of me, but never told me, because that's how things are. But
brothers and sisters?
None, just me. I took one look and said, "That's enough." But what she shared my books a lot with her friends as well, and she had one friend who was very, very churchy, very, very proper and very prim. And she gave her the Lindsay Gordon books, and I thought, you've given those to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth came back to them, and she said, "Well, I thought it was very interesting, but does she have to swear so much?" You're like, "Fuck yeah." So anybody else? You're all very shy. This one up the back there. And there's a gentleman over there in the middle. Gentleman.
Hello. If there was one writer or book or poet that you could add to the English Lit curriculum, what would it be?
Well, I would say Josephine Tay, Scottish crime writer who was writing in the 50s and earlier. And she is, I think, the bridge between the golden age and the modern psychological novel. She was the only person really writing at that point who was dealing, albeit in a very under-the-counter kind of way, with gender and sexuality. And all of her books are one way or another about identity. And I think she writes really well. And of course, she does. The Daughter of Time does have resonances for you here in Leicester. But I think she's much underrated. And actually, the Crime Writers Association did a poll some years ago and said, if you could have one book by a dead writer, who would you choose? And she came out top of that poll. She's the crime writer's crime writer.
Thanks very much. That was brilliant. I'm just curious about, if you look at all your works, all your novels, is there a commonality to their timetable? You know, when you're developing a book, Is there a life cycle in the book? Do you know what I mean?
I'm not entirely sure that I do. You mean in terms of the writing of it?
Aye.
Yeah, well, essentially, I mean, I write a book, it usually takes me 3 to 4 months to put it on paper, but it will have been in my head for a varying length of time before I'm ready to write it. So I usually write the first 3 months of the year, 3, 4 months of the year, because the weather's shite and you don't want to go out. So that's basically how it goes. I don't have a set. When I started out, I really felt that my weak point was plotting. And so I basically used to work out the whole story and do it on file cards and have a file card for every chapter or section. And when I was writing the Brannigans, which have got a main plot, a subplot, a secondary subplot, and what's going on in her life, I had them on different colour file cards. It was a bit like Countdown, I'll have 2 from the yellow file, 1 from the pink file. That worked for me for a long time. I would start at the beginning and carry on to the end. And some people say that kind of thing feels like a straitjacket to them, but for me it just felt like a roadmap. Because there were always points where I thought of a better way of doing something or a more economical way of doing something, and I could veer off and do that because I knew where I was coming back to on the story spine.
Yes.
And so that worked for me for a long time, and then it stopped working, and it inconveniently stopped working for me in the middle of a book. And I was really panicking. I tried to map the book out, and I'd got about halfway through, and I thought, I don't know what comes next. I don't quite know how to break it down from here. But eventually I thought, well, I'll write what I've got, and then when I get there, I'll know what to do. And I got there and didn't know what to do. And I was in a state of absolute panic. The deadline was getting closer. My editor would ring up from time to time saying, how's it going? I go, I'm writing. I was, as I say, quite desperate place. I feared that, I wondered if this was the end. Have I come to the point where I have nothing more to say? Is my career over? Because sometimes that happens with people. They run out of road. They just don't have anything more to say. And so I got to a point where I was due to deliver in 2 weeks' time, and I had half a book, and I eventually ran away. I went off to a place that I've stayed before in Italy, which is at the time was completely cut off. There was no phone line, no Wi-Fi, no nothing, no telly, nothing. And I got up every morning and started work at 9 o'clock. And I carried on till 7:30 in the evening, and I had a shower, and I had one of Mama Rosa's home-cooked dinners and a bottle of wine, and went to bed and got up in the morning and did the same thing again. I basically forced myself through it. I knew what the ending was. I knew what I was aiming for. And I got to the end of it, and I'd written 65,000 words in 9 days. And I couldn't speak in sentences by the end of it. I mean, the last day I was there, I told myself I was going to have a nice day in Siena, popping around the coffee shops and the bars. And the last day I couldn't do anything. I sat by the pool. And I sent it off to my editor, and a couple of weeks later she got back to me and said, this is the best first draft you've ever handed in. And I thought, oh God, no. Is this what it's going to be like now? But I think what it did to me was it taught me a lesson to trust myself. And so what I've developed since then really is what E.L. Doctorow calls driving at night writing. You start off from a place and you know what you're aiming for, and you maybe know 1 or 2 waypoints along the way, and you just can see the bit of road in front of you, and you fare forward hoping that eventually you'll get to a place where it's more or less where you planned to be from the beginning. And it's about, I think it's something that for me has something that took quite a long time to trust my narrative skills to that point where I feel able to do that. But it works for me now, and that's probably the main thing. But it might change again. It might change again. It's a process. It's a process. You're never finished learning how to do your craft. And so I just hope that it'll carry on working like this for a bit longer, because I don't want another panic like that. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Which what? Last question.
Oh.
Yes, sorry, we're over time.
Oh, sorry. Quick question then. I've listened to Desert Island Discs and always very interested in the writers and their method and their approach to writing. And occasionally, a couple of them have said that when they're writing a story, they don't know how it's going to end. And that seems amazing to me that somebody could do that. And I wondered whether you've ever done that, or they also say that the story has a life of its own and it takes off in a different direction. And I wondered whether you've ever known that as well.
No, I kind of feel like I'm in control because people sometimes say the characters go off and do their own thing. My characters don't do that. If they did, they'd get them doing the laundry. You know, but I mean, it's, whatever happens in your book comes from you. It comes from the back of your head or the front of your head or the side of your head, but it comes from you. It doesn't come from the outside. It's what you do with the things that you've got access to that makes it a story that works. So I've never started a book where I didn't know didn't know more or less what was going to happen. I had one book where I knew where the book was going to finish. I knew the room that was going to finish, and I knew who the 4 people in the room were going to be. Just wasn't entirely sure who was going to walk out of it alive. But by the time I was 2/3 of the way through, I knew. But no, I think for me, I've got to have a sense of what I'm aiming for, what I'm aiming towards. It might not be exactly what I thought it was going to be at the start, but I have to know what I'm aiming towards. But sometimes things change along the way, but I don't think it's the story taking over, taking control. It's just that as you go along, sometimes you think, well, that's a better way of doing this. So, thank you. So, thank you. Thank you.